Wedged across the Yangtze River in central China stands the largest dam ever built by human hands, a wall of concrete so vast it holds back an inland sea. It is the Three Gorges Dam, the biggest power station on the planet, and behind it stretches a reservoir hundreds of miles long, holding a volume of water almost impossible to picture, tens of billions of tons of it, pressing against a single barrier of concrete and steel. And below that barrier, spread across the flat, crowded plains of the lower Yangtze, live some of the most densely packed populations on Earth, city after city after city, tens of millions of people, all of them downstream, all of them living beneath the weight of that held-back sea, whether they think about it or not. The number that hangs over this is staggering. If the Three Gorges Dam were ever to fail catastrophically, the population and the potential path of the water that would come roaring down the Yangtze is estimated in the range of 132 million people. Not thousands, not millions. More than 130 million human beings living downstream of the largest artificial body of water ever assembled behind a single dam. It is very likely the greatest concentration of people ever placed below a single point of failure in the history of the world, and most of them go about their lives never once thinking about the wall of water suspended above them, held in place by the assumption that the dam will simply always hold. Now, let me be clear from the start, because honesty matters here. The Three Gorges Dam is considered by its builders to be structurally sound, and a total collapse is not something anyone is predicting for tomorrow. This is not a claim that the dam is about to break, but it is a serious look at what would happen if it did, at why the question is not as unthinkable as it sounds, at the real stresses building against it, and at the fact that China has already lived through a dam catastrophe so deadly it ranks among the worst disasters in human history, and then hid it from the world for decades. Because the story of the Three Gorges Dam is not just about a wall of concrete, it is about what it means to place 132 million lives on the far side of a single human-made thing, and to trust completely that it will never give way. Let me take you, just for a moment, into the scenario itself, so the number stops being abstract. Imagine the wall gives way. Downstream, in the city of Yichang, it is an ordinary evening, the riverfront busy, the lights coming on, millions of people going about their lives in a place that has sat safely below the dam for as long as anyone can remember. Upstream, the barrier that has held for decades finally loses its fight, and the inland sea behind it begins to pour through the breach, and then, all at once. As the opening widens, the full weight of hundreds of miles of reservoir starts down the gorge. There is no meaningful warning. By the time anyone in Yichang understands what is happening, the sound is already coming, a roar out of the mountains, and the river the city has always known rises into something monstrous. A wall of water surging out of the canyon far higher and faster than any flood in living memory. There is nowhere to run, because the water moves faster than people can flee, and there is no high ground close enough to reach. In minutes, the riverfront is gone, then the low districts, then more. And this is only the first city, the first minutes, the very top of a catastrophe that would then roll on, downstream, for hundreds of miles, city after city, through the most crowded plain on Earth. That is the shape of the thing this number describes. Now let me back up and show you why it would be so uniquely, historically, terrible. Let me start with the sheer scale of what is being held back, because you cannot understand the danger without grasping the size. The Three Gorges Dam is not merely large. It is a structure without real precedent, more than 1.5 miles wide, and roughly the height of a 60-story building, a barrier of concrete thrown across one of the great rivers of the world. And the reservoir it created is its own kind of monster, a body of water stretching back for hundreds of miles up the Yangtze Gorges, drowning entire valleys and towns when it was filled, holding tens of billions of cubic meters of water at full pool. To fill it, more than 1 million people had to be relocated from the lands that would be submerged. Entire cities moved to higher ground. The amount of water held behind the dam is so vast that scientists have noted that shifting that much mass to one spot on the planet has measurable effects. An almost unimaginable quantity of water concentrated in a single place. That is the thing suspended above the lower Yangtze. Not a lake in any ordinary sense, but an artificial inland sea held in the mountains by one wall, with the natural downhill pull of all that water forever pressing to be released. Every dam is a bargain with gravity, a promise to hold back what wants to flow down. The Three Gorges Dam makes that bargain on a scale nothing else on Earth comes close to. So let me walk you through what a catastrophic failure would actually look like. Because the geography of the Yangtze makes it a nightmare of a specific and terrible kind. If the dam were to give way and release that reservoir, the water would not spread out gently. It would funnel down the river channel as a wall, a flood wave of staggering height and speed, and the first thing in its path, just downstream, is the city of Yangtze, a metropolis of millions that sits almost immediately below the dam. It would have almost no warning, minutes at most, before an unimaginable volume of water arrived. From there, the Yangtze flows out of the mountains and onto the vast, flat, low-lying plains of central China, and this is the heart of the horror, because those plains are among the most densely populated agricultural and urban regions on the planet. The flood would spread across that flatland, and downstream lies Wuhan, a city of around 11 million people. And beyond it, a chain of major cities all the way down the river toward Nanjing, and ultimately Shanghai at the sea. The lower Yangtze is not empty countryside. It is one of the economic and demographic hearts of China, packed with cities, factories, farmland, and hundreds of millions of lives laid out across a flat plain that offers a flood almost nothing to stop it. A failure of the dam would send catastrophe rolling through all of it, city after city in sequence, and there is no high ground in much of that plain to flee to. That is why the number at risk is so staggering. The water, if it ever came, would be released into the single worst place on Earth to release it. And here is the part that makes the scale of the risk so real. If the dam ever failed, there would be almost no way to get the people out in time. Think about the timeline. The upper cities like Yichang would have minutes. The flood wave would then travel down the Yangtze, and while it would take longer to reach the cities further downstream, hours rather than minutes, that is still nowhere near enough time to evacuate populations measured in the many millions from a flat plain with limited high ground and roads that would instantly jam and then be overtaken. You cannot move 132 million people out of the path of a flood in a matter of hours. It has never been done, and it cannot be done. Even a perfect warning system, sounding the instant the dam failed, would be broadcasting into a situation with no solution, telling tens of millions of people to flee to high ground that, across much of the lower Yangtze plain, simply does not exist within reach. The only real protection these populations have is that the dam does not fail in the first place, because once it did, the geography and the numbers would make a true evacuation impossible. That is what it means to place this many people below a single wall. Their safety is not built on the ability to escape the disaster. It is built entirely on the disaster never being allowed to begin, which places an almost unbearable burden on that one structure to be perfect forever. Now, could it actually happen? This is where honesty and seriousness both matter, because the answer is that a total collapse is unlikely, but the dam faces real and growing stresses, and history says nothing is truly unbreakable. Consider the pressures the dam actually faces. There is the sheer force of extreme flooding, and the Yangtze produces some of the most powerful floods in the world. In recent years, historic flood seasons have pushed the reservoir toward its limits, filling it near its maximum capacity and forcing operators to manage enormous inflows. And as the climate warms and rainfall grows more extreme, those flood pressures are expected to intensify. There is the problem of sediment, because the Yangtze carries an immense load of silt. And that silt builds up behind the dam over time, a long-term challenge for any dam on a muddy river that must be constantly managed. There is the geology, because filling an enormous reservoir in a mountainous region puts new stresses on the surrounding rock, and the Three Gorges Reservoir has been associated with increased landslides along its banks and with small earthquakes. A phenomenon known as reservoir-induced seismicity in a region that has significant seismic hazards of its own. There have been persistent public debates and rumors about the dam's structural integrity, some of them exaggerated, which the authorities have firmly denied, but which speak to the anxiety that surrounds any structure holding back so much. And there is a darker consideration that strategists quietly discuss, which is that a dam like this is a potential target in a war, an enormous concentrated vulnerability that an adversary could, in theory, strike. No single one of these is a prediction of collapse, but together they describe a structure under real, and, in some ways, growing pressure, holding back an inland sea. In a seismically active region, facing intensifying floods for a very long time to come. Unbreakable is a word humans have used before about their greatest structures, and the river does not care what we call it. And this is not a purely theoretical stress test, because the dam has already been pushed hard within recent memory. During a series of extreme flood seasons in the past few years, torrential rains across the Yangtze Basin sent enormous surges of water into the reservoir, and the level behind the dam climbed toward its maximum, forcing operators to open the floodgates and release huge volumes downstream to relieve the pressure, even as cities below were already flooding from the rains. Those were the moments when the world briefly paid attention, when headlines noted that the water inside the Great Dam was nearing its limits and asked out loud whether the structure could handle what the river was throwing at it. The dam held, and its defenders pointed to that as proof of its strength. But it is also true that these were among the most serious tests the structure has faced, that they are becoming more frequent as the climate drives heavier rainfall, and that each one requires a delicate, high-stakes balancing act, holding back enough to protect the cities downstream while not letting the reservoir rise to a level that threatens the dam itself. That is the reality behind the reassurances. The dam is not sitting comfortably within a wide margin of safety. In the worst flood years, it is being actively managed at the edge of its design by people making urgent decisions in real time against a river that is growing more extreme. It has passed those tests so far. The concern is what happens when the river delivers a flood beyond anything the dam was ever designed to face, which is exactly the kind of event a warming climate is making more likely. And here is the reason this cannot be dismissed as fear-mongering, because China has already lived exactly this nightmare on a smaller but still catastrophic scale and buried it. In August of 1975, in Henan province, a powerful typhoon dumped an extraordinary amount of rain on the region, and the Banqiao Dam, along with a cascade of other dams around it, was overwhelmed. The Banqiao Dam had been considered strong, even called unbreakable by some, and when the water rose beyond anything it was designed for, it failed. And it did not fail alone. Its collapse sent a wall of water downstream that overwhelmed and burst dozens of other dams below it in a catastrophic chain reaction, one failure triggering the next, unleashing a flood of almost incomprehensible violence across the countryside. The immediate flood wave killed tens of thousands of people outright, drowned in the night with no warning, and in the aftermath, with the region devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, and vast areas cut off, disease and famine took hold, and the total death toll from the disaster and its aftermath is estimated to have reached into the range of 150,000 people or more, with some estimates far higher. It was one of the deadliest technological disasters in all of human history. A dam failure that killed more people than almost any comparable event, and for decades the Chinese government kept it hidden, the full scale of the catastrophe not widely known to the outside world until many years later. That is the crucial context. The question of whether a great Chinese dam can fail catastrophically and kill enormous numbers of people is not hypothetical. It has already happened. The country has already buried the dead from exactly this kind of disaster, and it did so within living memory. Banqiao is the proof that unbreakable is a story we tell ourselves, and the river has broken that story before. And now consider what makes a Three Gorges failure a category beyond even Banqiao, because everything about it is larger. Banqiao, as horrific as it was, involved dams far smaller than the Three Gorges, releasing far less water into a region less densely populated than the lower Yangtze. A failure of the Three Gorges Dam would involve the largest reservoir ever held behind a single dam, releasing a volume of water that dwarfs the Banqiao disaster into the path of a population many times larger. In the industrial and economic heartland of the world's most populous nation, and it would carry the same terrifying possibility of a cascade, because there are other dams and infrastructure downstream, and the flood control of the entire lower Yangtze depends on a system of dikes and levees that were never built to withstand the sudden release of an inland sea from above. Those levees, overwhelmed, could fail in sequence, spreading the flood far beyond the river channel across the plains where the cities and farms lie. The scale of destruction would not just be a larger version of Banqiao. It would be something the modern world has never witnessed, a flood disaster measured against the largest concentration of people and economic activity ever placed downstream of a single structure. When you combine the biggest reservoir, the most water, the flattest and most crowded floodplain, and a network of downstream defenses not designed for such a release, you get a potential catastrophe that stands in raw human terms close to the top of anything that could happen on the surface of the planet short of a war. And the destruction would not stop at the floodwater, because the Three Gorges Dam is woven into the very functioning of China in ways that would multiply the disaster. The dam is the largest power station on Earth, generating a colossal amount of electricity that feeds into the grid supplying central and eastern China. Losing it would tear an enormous hole in the nation's power supply in an instant. The Yangtze itself is one of the busiest and most important shipping arteries in the world, a watery highway carrying a vast flow of goods into the interior of the country, and a catastrophe on this scale would shatter that artery, cutting off a major channel of China's economy. The lower Yangtze region that would be flooded is not just heavily populated. It is one of the most productive industrial and agricultural zones in the country, so the destruction would strike at the food supply, the manufacturing base, and the economic engine of a nation of well over 1 billion people all at once. And the human displacement would be beyond anything in modern experience. Tens of millions of survivors driven from destroyed cities and drowned farmland, a refugee crisis of a scale never seen. A disaster like this would not be a regional tragedy contained within China. It would send shockwaves through the entire global economy, through supply chains, food markets, and manufacturing that the whole world depends on. The dam is not just a wall holding back water. It is a load-bearing pillar of the modern world, and its catastrophic failure would bring down far more than the valley below it. And there is a deep paradox at the center of all this that is worth sitting with, because the Three Gorges Dam was built, in large part, to prevent flooding. For thousands of years, the Yangtze has been one of the deadliest rivers on Earth, its natural floods periodically drowning the same low-lying plains and killing enormous numbers of people. Disasters that killed hundreds of thousands in the last century alone. One of the central justifications for building the dam was flood control, using that vast reservoir to catch and hold back the river surges and protect the cities downstream. And by that measure, the dam does real and enormous good, taming floods that would otherwise still be killing people every generation, along with generating clean power and enabling shipping deep into the interior. That is why it exists and why the risk is accepted. But it creates a terrible paradox. In order to protect the plains from the river's natural floods, engineers concentrated an unprecedented volume of water behind a single wall, which means the structure built to prevent flooding is now itself the single largest potential source of flooding in the history of the world. The solution to the smaller, recurring disaster created the possibility of a far larger, singular one. It is a bargain that trades many smaller, more frequent floods for the tiny chance of one catastrophic release, and most of the time, that is a bargain that saves lives. The danger is entirely in the tail, in the rare extreme event, but the tail, in this case, holds 132 million people. So how do we hold both truths at once? That the dam is considered sound and that the stakes of its failure are almost beyond imagining? That is exactly the nature of this kind of risk, and it is worth understanding clearly. This is what experts call a low probability, high consequence risk, the most psychologically difficult kind of danger for human beings to deal with. Because the chance of any given catastrophe in any given year is genuinely low, it is easy and even reasonable most of the time to not worry about it. The dam is monitored, managed, and defended by a nation with every possible motivation to keep it standing. But low probability is not the same as zero, and when the consequence of failure is 132 million people in the path of a flood, even a very small probability carries an almost unbearable weight of risk, because you are multiplying a tiny chance by an astronomical cost. And the pressures are not static. The floods are intensifying with the changing climate. The sediment keeps accumulating. The reservoir keeps stressing the geology. The structure ages, as all structures do, decade after decade. So the calculation is not a comfortable, fixed, low risk, but a low risk sitting beneath slowly growing stresses, guarding against a consequence so vast that no responsible person can simply wave it away. We have concentrated an unprecedented amount of potential catastrophe behind a single wall and then asked that wall to hold, perfectly, forever, against a river and a climate that are both changing. That is the bargain, and it is a bargain with no room for a single catastrophic mistake. Stand on the observation deck above the Three Gorges Dam and look at it, and it radiates permanence and power. A monument to what human beings can build, the mighty river tamed, the largest machine of its kind on Earth, humming with generated electricity, and it feels, standing there, utterly and eternally solid. But upstream stretches that inland sea, hundreds of miles of held-back water pressing eternally against the concrete, and downstream, out across the flat and crowded plains. 132 million people live their lives beneath it, trusting a wall they cannot see to hold back a weight they cannot imagine. China has built the greatest dam in history, and in doing so it has placed the largest population ever assembled below a single point of failure, and staked their safety on the promise that the largest reservoir ever created will stay exactly where it is put, through every flood, every earthquake, every year, without exception, forever. Most likely, it will hold for a very long time. But the country has already learned, once in a disaster it tried to erase from memory, that the word unbreakable is a story, and that when a great dam finally loses its argument with the water, the river writes the ending, and it writes it in a scale of death that the survivors spend generations trying to forget. The wall stands. The sea waits behind it, and 132 million people go about their day, downstream, trusting that tomorrow will be like today, which, on almost every day in history, it is, right up until the one day it is not. We have built many great walls against the water over the centuries, and told ourselves each time that this one, at last, was strong enough. The river has been patient with some of them and merciless with others, and it keeps no record of our confidence. It only keeps rising and falling and rising again, pressing forever against whatever we put in its way, waiting, as water always waits, for the smallest opening. The largest dam on Earth was built to make sure that opening never comes. 132 million lives are the wager that it never will.